Hey guys, this is Mark Hutten with AdultAspergersChat.com, and today I want to talk to you guys about re-injuring the relationship. So, back in the day when you first got together, there was appreciation for one another, wasn't there? There was some love, compassion, and even gratitude, right? All of that is still there, but it's laying dormant because you are continuing to re-injure the relationship, if not a day-by-day basis, certainly a week-by-week basis. Think of it like this. If you were to stub your toe this morning, it would be swollen, black and blue. You may have even fractured your toe a little bit, but if you wrap it, if you nurture it, if you walk softly, it will heal itself, right? But if you re-injured it again tomorrow, and then again the day after, it would never heal. In fact, it would progressively get worse because you're injuring it faster than it can heal. So with the relationship, the re-injury occurs when you replay past hurts. So when you review the past injuries, things that were said and done that were hurtful, that's the content memory. You also replay the emotional memory. In other words, you feel bad all over again, just like you did when the actual event happened. This now influences how you speak to one another and how you behave to one another today. Reviewing those past hurts chronically, in some cases, feeling the pain all over again, contaminates how you speak to one another and behave toward one another today. That's re-injury. You're not talking to one another today like you did 5-10 years ago, for example. Everything is influenced from past hurts. So, if you were to stop re-injuring the relationship, the sense of well-being and appreciation that was there in the beginning will come back, just like a cork that you pushed down into the water and you finally let go of that cork and it will float right back to the top again. So when you stop re-injuring the relationship, you will get back to a semblance of how it was in the beginning, where there was appreciation, there was love, there was compassion, there was gratitude. And again, how do you stop re-injuring? You stop chronically reviewing your past hurts, which means now you're chronically feeling the pain all over again, which means now the way you talk to one another and behave towards one another is contaminated by the past. That's the re-injury that we want to eliminate. Hope that makes sense, guys. I have an NT ladies only group, an ASD men's only group, and a neurodiverse couples group. You're welcome to join, and there will be links underneath this video where you can sign up. Thank you. Hey guys, this is Mark Hutten with AdultAspergersChat.com, and I oftentimes get emails or comments on my blog post or Facebook pages from NT wives stating that they don't understand mind blindness. They say something along the lines of, I just don't understand why he can't see certain things. I tell him over and over how I feel, and he just never seems to get it. And I just don't understand this mind blindness thing. Well, it's hard for somebody who is mind sighted, to make up a term, to understand somebody who's mind blind. Now, you could easily imagine what it would be like to be blind. All you'd have to do is put some blinders on and walk around the house, try to get out in the driveway to get in your car and try to make your way through the grocery, and you could easily duplicate that and know exactly what it's like to be blind. Or you could plug up your ears and you would know what it's like to be deaf, but you're never going to know, for example, I'm just going to make up a perhaps ridiculous example, what it would be like growing up as a child in a Nazi concentration camp. We can't duplicate that because we'd have to go back in time, we'd have to set up a concentration camp, we'd have to relocate to Germany, you'd have to regress from adulthood down to childhood, and so there's just too many there's no way to replicate that or do an experiment, so to speak, to give you some indication of what it might be like to be a 5-year-old little girl growing up in a Nazi concentration camp. You're never going to know what that feels like. So in the same way, since you're mind-sighted you're never going to know what it is to be mind blind. And so it would make sense to me why it doesn't make sense to you that he doesn't get it. So the best I can do to help you is set up a little experiment here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make 2 comments, and I want you to tell me which one is sarcastic and which one is authentic or honest. Okay, you ready? Thanks a lot, Dave. Okay, here's the second one. Thanks a lot, Dave. Okay, of those 2, which one was sarcastic and which one was genuine? You have no clue. The mind-blind individual, or the person with alexithymia, which we call them, they would be the alexithymic, both of those statements appeared the same. But here's what they looked like for the mind-sighted person. Here's the first one. Thanks a lot, Dave. Here's the second one. Thanks a lot, Dave. Now you can clearly see the first one was honest, the second one was sarcastic. The mind-blind individual can't tell the difference between the 2. And so when you are, for example, sarcastic with your mind-blind spouse and expect him to get that it's sarcasm, he's not going to get it. Or if you say, well, I feel this way about that, and you expect him to take how you feel and apply it to some course of action he's supposed to take, he's not going to get that. So with this business of being out of touch with what other people might be thinking or what they might be feeling, we have to be very concrete instead of vague. We have to make our message very short so we don't end up with data dumping, and now he has data overload, and there's too many factors involved to dissect each one and figure out what he's supposed to get. I hope that makes sense, guys. Thank you.
Mark, I have a question, and I'm okay with you adding my voice message and your answer to a public YouTube video. My husband of almost 15 years has high-functioning autism. We have 2 children, and our oldest son is 13, and he also has high-functioning autism. The biggest conflict that we run into is with his mother, my husband's mother. She is very opinionated, very strong-headed, and my husband wasn't diagnosed with autism until about 4 years ago. And so she is just not educated about it at all. And she really refuses to see him with autism. But it's very obvious if she spent more time with him. We do live 12 hours from her. The biggest issue we have is she sees that our oldest son is different. He does not go with the flow very easily. And so she gets very upset that he doesn't easily do what she wants. And so she does push him aside. She even told us that he brings out the worst in her. So there's many hurtful things that she has said. And it's been a while since we've seen her because of COVID. And so it brings a lot of anxiety upon me being around her, because I feel like I have to defend my children, and my husband really struggles with standing up to them. He's very scared of disappointing or standing up to his parents, especially his mother. He wants to, but he's not quite sure how to do it because words just don't come easily to him, especially under pressure. So how can I help him to learn to stand up for me and his children?
Okay, thanks for the question. And one of the first things that we need to think of is the business of guilt. And so your mother-in-law has discovered that both her son and her grandson have an autism spectrum disorder. It's not too surprising that there might be some initial denial, because there could be some guilt associated with that, what I would just call false guilt, because she might be thinking, well, if they have autism, maybe that's something I did. Maybe it's something that I did wrong while I was pregnant, or maybe I was a bad parent in some shape, form, or fashion. So she may be blaming herself, even at an unconscious level, and that's too painful of a realization. And also it's inaccurate, and so some of that denial is protection against the thought that, must have been my fault. So, high functioning autism, also called ASD level 1, is often mentioned in the media, television, newspapers, social networks, and whatnot. But the truth is that besides remembering Dustin Hoffman's performance in the movie Rain Man as an autistic savant, most people really have no clue about what an autism spectrum disorder is. They think of it as some kind of a disease or something that is going to be debilitating over the lifespan, when in fact people on the autism spectrum have way more strengths than they do weaknesses, and often excel more than typical people. So you'd want to assure your mother-in-law and other family members, as far as that goes, that even though there's no single cause or cure for high-functioning autism, it is certainly treatable. Although it is a lifelong disorder, studies show that early diagnosis and intervention can lead to significant improved outcomes. So with the support of your mother-in-law and other family members, along with appropriate services, your 13-year-old son will definitely live a full, healthy, and meaningful life, no doubt about that. Another thing you'll want to do is explain to your mother-in-law that different circumstances call for different parenting. So explain that while you're trying to give your son as normal an environment as possible, there may be things that you'll do or not do for him that you would for the other children in the family. For example, there may be different rules and consequences. There might be different sleeping arrangements, different dietary or safety concerns. So you may want to gently explain that this doesn't mean that you're playing favorites or that you're babying your son. You're simply addressing his unique needs and protecting him from unnecessary stress. Also, I would encourage you to not be offended. You would want to ensure your mother-in-law and other family members that your son's lack of social interactions with them is simply par for the course and not a personal affront. After all, high-functioning autism is, in essence, a disorder of social skills. Also, there's nothing wrong with you encouraging your mother-in-law to discuss her fears, disappointments, confusion, concerns, whatever's going on. Remember the feelings that you had when you first heard that your son had high-functioning autism, and then later when you heard that your husband had it. So realize that your mother-in-law will most likely experience similar emotions. It would also be good to give your mother-in-law some information about HFA, but only on a need-to-know basis, because if you bombard her with a ton of information, that's going to maybe even make her more confused and even more alarmed. So, for example, you may want to just skip the nitty-gritty details of a gluten-free, casein-free diet. You may want to postpone telling stories about HFA children who run away or who still aren't potty trained by age 8. And you want to offer her a short list of internet sources. What we're dealing with here is not your mother-in-law purposely trying to be insensitive or uncaring. It's just lack of information. So with a few internet sources that she can research, she can explore the world of autism spectrum disorders at her own pace. Also, in a very diplomatic way, you would want to remind her the importance of accepting your son for who he is, not who she hoped he was supposed to be. Children on the autism spectrum do need more space. They need more understanding and patience. And lastly, if she simply doesn't get it, then you could suggest a support group. If your mother-in-law or any other extended family members for that matter have difficulty understanding or accepting the diagnosis, then they really should consider getting in touch with a support group in order to hear other families' stories, because there's other grandmothers, mother-in-laws, moms, and so on that have been there and done that and had denial and resistance in the beginning, but now have come to some form of acceptance. And hearing those stories from other families who have been down that road can be very reassuring.
Mark, I have a question, and I'm okay with you adding my voice message and your answer to a public YouTube video. My question is, what's the best way for people with Asperger's to manage their anxiety? Thank you, Ken.
Well, in answer to the question, there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all or a cookie-cutter approach for anxiety, because what causes your anxiety might not cause anxiety for somebody else, and what alleviates your anxiety might not alleviate that anxiety in somebody else. So it's going to be a very individual approach to find out what works best for you. But let's make a distinction between fear and anxiety, because fear is something that you're afraid of, but you know exactly what it is. For example, let's say you hate going to the dentist and you've got to go to the dentist next week, and you know you're going to sit there and get a cavity worked on, and you kind of predict what's going to go on. You already know because you've been there and done it before. So yes, there's some apprehension there, but you know what's going to happen. Anxiety, though, is being afraid of something and you don't know what it is. You just know that you feel anxious, and the anxiety that's going on in the moment is not the event itself, because you don't even know what the event is. It's your self-talk. So we have to look at self-talk. So if the event actually manifests itself in your life, the one that you've been worrying about so much, that actual event will be way less emotionally painful than the worrying about that event prior to the actual occurrence. The actual event is not the source of your anxiety. It's the thinking about the event that is the source of your anxiety. Think of it like this. Let's say you're in college, you've got a big exam coming up, maybe it's the final, and it's super important that you get a good grade on this. And maybe you have some test anxiety, and so you engage in this if-then business. If I freeze up, then I might flunk this test. Or if it's harder than I think, and if I didn't study enough for this test, I may get a bad grade. And if I don't pass this exam, I may flunk the course. And if I flunk the course, I may have to take it again. And if I have to take the course again, then it's going to take longer for me to get my degree. And if it takes longer for me to get my degree, it's going to cost me more money. And if my parents are helping me financially, they may get upset with me for taking longer than expected. And so you get in this if-then loop, a bunch of what-ifs, and that is the anxiety. Another example is there was a lady who had IBS symptoms, and it triggered her anxiety, and so her commute was particularly stressful, so she gets up and she starts having some stomach issues, and then she starts getting sucked into this if-then loop. If I have stomach troubles this morning, then I'm going to have anxiety on the way to work. And if I have anxiety on the way to work, then I'm going to have to stop at a gas station somewhere on an emergency basis. And if I do that, then I'm going to be late for work. And if I'm late for work, then I'm going to get a point. And if I get too many points, I'm going to get fired. And so you're down in this rabbit hole of what ifs. There again, that is the anxiety, not so much the drive to work in and of itself. So you get the point, right? The anxiety is the what if business. It is the if-then loop that you get sucked into. So what we can do in that case is we can look for triggers to our anxiety and maybe even journal those. It wouldn't necessarily have to be a notebook. It could be one piece of paper. And so after you have an anxiety-provoking event and you're calm, you could write down, okay, what happened right before I got anxious? That is the trigger. And then you would also want to write down what was my self-talk during this anxiety-provoking event. So let's use an example of a husband on the autism spectrum, and his neurotypical wife is upset about something, and so she is asking a lot of questions. You know, maybe she's saying things like, why can't you ever blah, 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 or why do you always do such and such, or what were you thinking when you didn't follow through with blah, blah, blah. And so she's upset and she's kind of interrogating, and so that is the anxiety-provoking event. And then maybe your self-talk was, oh my God, here we go again, complain, complain, complain. I'm always in trouble. I didn't do anything wrong. Why is she treating me like a child? I feel so criticized. I have to defend myself. I have to prove that she is wrong, etc. So in this example, her complaints about the relationship not going right did download as a trigger for you, but it was the self-talk that exacerbated the anxiety. So what do we want to do? We want to begin the business of practicing different self-talk. So using the example that I just illustrated where she is upset and she's kind of quizzing you, why can't you do this? Why do you always do that? Because she's frustrated and at her wit's end, and you're downloading that as nothing but criticism and put downs and shaming and blaming. So what could you do differently next time in the way of self-talk? Here's some ideas. I could realize that she's quizzing me because the relationship is really important to her. Another thought could be, I'll stay and listen, and then I'll paraphrase back what I heard so I can understand her point. In other words, I'm going to listen to understand rather than listen to mount a defense. Another thought could be, I'll ask what I can do to help rather than just do some version of shutdown or meltdown. So we want to replace the negative self-talk that sets us up for the if-then loop with more positive, constructive, and realistic inner dialogue that is more representative of what might actually be going on. So in summary, The best anxiety reduction strategy for you will be for you to identify what types of self-talk you engage in when you're in the throes of a particular anxiety-producing event. And each event will trigger different self-talk. You want to look at those, and you want to begin the process of coming up with some deliberate replacements for the negative self-talk. So that's the key term, deliberate. You will have to start thinking deliberately when you're in the middle of the storm. Hey guys, this is Mark, and I wanted to specifically talk to the guys on the autism spectrum in this video. In the men's group, the therapy group that we do, we get into some of the traits of the disorder that get in the way of relationships. And we talk about mind blindness, alexithymia, some executive functions deficits, and of course anxiety. But I wanted to narrow it down in this video because I find that guys on the autism spectrum, people in general, wouldn't necessarily have to be men, do tend to have some thinking errors because of the mind blindness stuff. So I just wanted to take a couple minutes and go into some greater detail with that because I keep getting a lot of questions about thinking errors. So on that note, I'm going to talk about some of these. Let's talk briefly about all or nothing thinking. And so this would be where you think in absolute terms, pretty much black and white thinking, okay? And you'll know if you're engaging in this all or nothing thinking if you use terms like always, every, never, like you always do this, or every time this happens, blah, 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 or I never, blah, 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 and so on. For instance, let's say you get a bad report from your boss. You know, he was disappointed in something that you did, and so you view yourself as a total failure. Okay, you did 110 things right, and the one thing you did wrong, you're going to consider that, well, because I did make a mistake at work and got reprimanded by my boss there. That would be an example of all or nothing thinking. Catastrophizing. Now, this would be where you focus on the worst possible outcome, even though that outcome may be like very, very unlikely. Or you think about a situation, another version of catastrophizing would be thinking that a situation is unbearable or impossible when really it's just uncomfortable. So you're kind of exaggerating the difficulty. Does that make sense? And now let's look at the business of disqualifying the positive. So here you continually shoot down positive experiences for very arbitrary and impromptu reasons. So in this way, you can maintain a negative belief that is contradicted by your everyday experiences. So, for example, the fact that I am an excellent artist doesn't count because everything else about my life sucks. So that would be an example of disqualifying the positive. Let's look at emotional reasoning now. This would be when the individual makes decisions and arguments even based on how he feels rather than on objective reality. So what you're doing here with emotional reasoning is you're saying, because I feel this way, therefore it is a fact. Now let's look at fortune telling. This is anticipating things, just expecting that things will turn out badly. And this is where the person feels convinced that his prediction is already an established fact. So, for example, because I think that I will fail to make, let's say that there is a particular advancement at work that you are wanting. And it's a step up the ladder and it's a little more pay. But you say, for example, because I think that I will fail at getting to that next rung on the corporate ladder, I most certainly will fail. Right? Because I think I will fail, therefore I will fail. So I'm basically assuming that my thoughts, in this case, can predict the future. Okay, let's go to jumping to conclusions. Now, this is assuming something negative where there is actually no evidence to support it. Let's say, for example, and again, I'm kind of talking to the guys on the autism spectrum here. And it seems, I'm using the examples of kind of work-related stuff, really. So let's say, for example, your coworkers, maybe they're not as friendly to you as you would like. And so you make the sweeping generalization that none of your peers, none of your coworkers like you. But you really don't really have any evidence that that is the case. So again, with jumping to conclusions, you're assuming something negative when really there's really no actual evidence to support that. And you might even talk to one of your coworkers and say to him, I don't feel like anybody here likes me. And this one coworker that you're confiding in goes, no, everybody here likes you. I've never heard anybody say one bad thing about you. So let's move on to labeling now. Now this involves explaining by naming. So rather than describing the specific behavior, the individual assigns a label to someone or himself that puts the other person or himself in absolute and unalterable negative terms. I'm going to make up another example. A good statement that would coincide with labeling would be if you say something along the lines of, my coworker won't talk to me, therefore he is a jerk, or therefore he is a narcissist. So you're basically labeling people based on your perception of their behavior. I hope that makes sense. Let's move on now to magnification. Now this basically involves exaggerating the negatives. So you may have had 10 things go right for you today. One thing goes wrong at the end of the day, and so you view the entire day as a disaster. So this involves exaggerating the negatives, and really what coincides with that is ignoring the positives. So mental filter, what's the next one? This is focusing exclusively on certain aspects of something while ignoring the rest. For instance, let's say the individual selectively hears the one tiny negative thing surrounded by all the big positive things. I'll use the example of, let's say your boss makes 9 positive comments about your project and one little slight constructive criticism there at the very end, but you obsess about that one little short piece of constructive criticism that he threw in at the very end of a long list of really praising you for good work. Mind reading. This involves assuming the intentions of others. You just presume that you know what they're up to. For example, the individual may arbitrarily conclude that his peer is thinking negatively of him, but even though you're thinking that, you don't bother to check it out and actually ask. So let's see, we've got mind reading. I'm sorry, we just did that one. Minimization. This involves understating the positives. Enough said about that. Overgeneralization. So this is taking isolated cases and using them to make sweeping generalizations. For example, let's say the individual views a single negative event as a never-ending pattern of defeat. Okay? He views a single negative event as a never-ending pattern of defeat. For example, my wife just yelled at me. She's always yelling at me, therefore she must not like me. So there's a perfect example of overgeneralization. Let's go on to personalization now. Now this occurs when the person holds himself personally responsible for an event that really isn't entirely under his control. Okay? I'm going to make up a ridiculous example. Let's say your parents got divorced when you were a teenager. And so you say, my parents got divorced, it must be because I was a bad son. Or my NT wife seems to be upset, therefore it must have something to do with me. And so you're just assuming that you're the one, that you're the cause of somebody else's behavior. And the last one we're going to look at is shoulding. And this is when the person focuses on what he cannot control. For example, he concentrates on what he thinks should or ought to be, rather than the actual situation he is faced with. And if you use the term should a lot, oh, I should have done that, or I shouldn't have done this. Or you can use the shoulding with other people. You shouldn't do that, or you should do that, or you must do this. That's an example of shame. So there we have the 14 thinking errors that tie into, at some level, the mind blindness issue.
Mark, I have a question, and I'm okay with you adding my voice message and your answer to a public YouTube video. My question is as follows. Is there enough evidence to describe a specific pattern of deterioration of a marriage in which the woman is suffering from Asperger, whether diagnosed or not, and typically not, and the male is neurotypical? I'm specifically wondering whether the continuous masking of the Asperger woman and the need to take the mask off from time to time in the most convenient place at home, as well as her frequent anxiety, create a pattern in which the neurotypical man, who is typically unaware of the Asperger, responds negatively to lack of empathy and the feeling that he and or the kids come only second after her work or a special interest, which unavoidably create distance between the couple. And quite paradoxically, the Asperger woman blames the neurotypical man for being distant, small-minded, and maybe oversensitive as the cause for all of their marriage problems. Thank you very much in advance. Thanks.
Okay, well, thanks for the question. As far as evidence for a specific pattern that you described, I don't know of any actual research that would contain all of those elements, but there's definitely anecdotal evidence and reports that what you described, which is multifactorial, by the way, definitely occurs in many ASD plus NT relationships. You mentioned masking, and especially doing the masking at home. And so what goes on there, especially with female on the autism spectrum, is I don't necessarily use the term masking. I use the term mimicry. So if we'll use your wife as the example, if she's at work, what typically happens is the ASD individual is not sure exactly how to act socially. And from a very young age, they've learned how to copy the behavior of others. And so they get mimicry down to a science. That's what I guess you're referring to as masking. And so when you act as if you are typical all day long, that's exhausting. And it's also involves a lot of denying the self and faking being somebody else. Constantly observing others, constantly on alert to, oh, did I say something wrong, or am I doing something wrong, or how should I behave in this meeting, or what do I need to say to that coworker? So that is very exhausting and anxiety provoking. And so when she gets home at the end of a long day of doing that, she does need to decompress. And unfortunately, what happens when the ASD spouse who mimics throughout the day comes home, the NT spouse is often the target of anxiety reduction. Now, I do want to deviate from the question here just a little bit and make the distinction between mimicry and masking. Masking suggests that the individual is purposely trying to be deceitful and trying to hide something that is perhaps malicious, whereas mimicry suggests trying to fit in. Masking is deceitful. Mimicry is trying to fit in. Masking is trying to exclude something. Mimicry is trying to include something. So in this case, the ASD spouse feels very comfortable being her true self in front of the individual, the significant other in her life. She feels very comfortable being her true self in front of him. And so tolerance is probably low. Need to decompress, isolate is probably very high. Any type of sensory sensitivities or additional overload in the evening times with family will be met with some version of shutdown or meltdown. And then, of course, the NT spouse is going to respond defensively, which exacerbates the situation. It's also typical for the ASD spouse to have a special interest. And I think what you've described in your question is, in this case, the special interest is work. And it's not that she doesn't care about you or the kids, but she spends most of her energy with work and has very little left over. And it's not that she lacks empathy, it's that she doesn't display empathy in the way that is meaningful to perhaps you or the kids. It's also not uncommon for the occurrence of the ASD spouse being somewhat non-empathic, we will say, and being more absorbed in her special interest or work. And then the other family members feel like they're not important, They feel like the ASD spouse is being selfish, insensitive, uncaring, perhaps even narcissistic, and they may angrily and justifiably blame the ASD spouse for not really truly connecting and being present and showing validation, empathy, emotional reciprocity, and so on. But due to the ASD spouse's mind blindness and alexithymia and some executive function deficits, these pleas from the NT for connection download in the ASD brain as criticism. So what you've described is a sequence that contains certain elements that are quite common. It's more common in the role reversal situation where it's the ASD male and the NT female, but it certainly can occur in the way that you described. So the question then becomes, how can the NT spouse voice, in this case, his concerns about a disconnection and a feeling like comes second compared to work? How can he voice his concerns about that in a way that doesn't download as criticism in the ASD wife's brain? And therein lies the dilemma. A communication strategy would need to take into account those two things. There's not going to be a one-size-fits-all communication strategy because each individual is different, each couple is different, and each way that they argue and try to problem solve is different. Having said that, though, there is a link below this video. I do a couples group. We look at some very individualized methods to establish communication.
Hey, this is Mark Hutten. Would you like to schedule a one-on-one Zoom call? Okay, it's so simple. Just look under any of my videos in the description area. Click on this Calendly link. Now you see my calendar. Pick your month, your day, anytime that's available. Enter your name and email address. Then you'll get a follow-up email with the Zoom link on the day and time that you picked. And voila, we will talk.